The first humans to set foot on Mars will never return to Earth. This is not pessimism or failure of imagination. It is the logical conclusion of overlapping physical constraints, biological realities, and engineering limits that together form a trap from which no combination of technology, planning, or courage can guarantee escape. The trap is not a failure of design. It is built into the architecture of interplanetary travel itself, into the distance between worlds, into the weakness of human biology under altered gravity, into the unforgiving mechanics of orbital windows and propellant mass, and into the accumulation of small degradations. Over months and years on an alien surface, erode the machinery and bodies necessary for departure. To understand why the first Mars explorers will be stranded is to understand that the mission to Mars is not symmetric. Going and returning are not mirror images of one another. The outbound journey benefits from preparation, redundancy, and the full industrial capacity of Earth. The return journey depends on systems built in place, on fuel manufactured from Martian atmosphere, on hardware that must survive months of abrasive dust and temperature swings, on bodies that must remain functional after prolonged exposure to radiation and reduced gravity, and on a chain of events so intricately interdependent that the failure of any single link eliminates the possibility of escape. The distance to Mars is not merely number. It is a gulf across which supplies cannot be sent quickly, across which rescue cannot arrive, and across which the physics of rocketry imposes costs that grow exponentially with every kilogram of additional mass. Unlike low Earth orbit, where crew can return within hours, or the Moon, where Earth is always visible and return takes days, Mars is separated from Earth by months of travel time and by launch windows that open only once every 26 months. Miss a launch window, and the next opportunity is more than 2 years away. By then, life support consumables will have dwindled, hardware will have aged, and the physiological decline of the crew will have progressed to a point where the rigors of launch and transit may exceed human tolerance. Mathematics of orbital mechanics govern everything. Earth and Mars orbit the Sun at different speeds and distances. Earth completes an orbit in 1 year. Mars takes nearly 2. The planets align favorably for minimum energy transfer only when Mars is positioned ahead of Earth in its orbit, allowing a spacecraft to follow an elliptical trajectory that intercepts Mars approximately halfway through its orbit around the Sun. This alignment repeats every 26 months. Between these windows, the energy required to reach Mars increases drastically, often beyond the capability of available propulsion systems. The return journey faces the same constraint. Departure from Mars must occur when Earth and Mars are positioned such that an outbound trajectory from Mars will intersect Earth's orbit at the time Earth arrives at that point. This return window is similarly narrow and occurs roughly every 26 months. The intervals do not align neatly. The outbound and return windows are offset, meaning that astronauts arriving at Mars during one transfer window must wait on the surface for approximately 1.5 years before the next return window opens. This is not optional. It is dictated by celestial mechanics. During that surface stay, every system required for survival and for the return mission must continue to function. Every component must endure Martian conditions. Every astronaut must remain healthy enough to survive launch, transit, and re-entry. The margin for error is not generous. It is nearly non-existent. Consider the fuel required for return. A spacecraft capable of lifting a crew from the Martian surface and accelerating to the velocity necessary for Earth transfer requires propellant mass many times greater than the dry mass of the vehicle itself. On Earth, rockets are launched with all propellant loaded at the pad. On Mars, no such infrastructure exists. The fuel must either be brought from Earth or manufactured on Mars. Bringing sufficient return fuel from Earth is prohibitively expensive in terms of mass. Every kilogram of fuel for the return journey must itself be launched from Earth, carried across interplanetary space, and landed on Mars. The tyranny of the rocket equation applies at every stage. To land 1 kilogram on Mars, several kilograms must be launched from Earth. To launch 1 kilogram from Mars, multiple kilograms of fuel are required. When the fuel itself must be transported, the mass compounds recursively. The result is that missions relying entirely on Earth-supplied fuel become impractically massive and expensive. The solution, proposed across decades of mission architecture studies, is in situ resource utilization. USRU means manufacturing propellant on Mars using local resources. Han occur in Mars using local resources. The Martian atmosphere is mostly carbon dioxide, with hydrogen brought from Earth or extracted from Martian water ice. Carbon dioxide can be chemically processed through the Sabatier reaction to produce methane and water. Methane and oxygen, produced by electrolyzing water, form a viable rocket propellant combination. On paper, ISRU is elegant, yay. In reality, it is an industrial chemical plant that must be transported to Mars, deployed autonomously or with minimal crew oversight, and operated reliably in an environment for which it was not natively designed. The machinery required for ISRU is complex. It must compress thin Martian atmosphere, which has a surface pressure less than 1% of Earth's atmosphere. It must separate and purify carbon dioxide. It must crack water ice if hydrogen is not brought in sufficient quantity. It must refrigerate and store cryogenic propellants at temperatures where methane liquefies at minus 161 degrees Celsius and oxygen at minus 183 degrees Celsius. It must do all this while powered by solar panels that accumulate dust or by nuclear reactors that must be shielded and cooled in an environment where dust storms can obscure the sun for weeks and where temperature swings between day and night exceed 100 degrees Celsius. Each subsystem is a potential point of failure. Compressors can clog with dust. Any failure that halts propellant production jeopardizes the return mission. If production falls behind schedule, the return window may pass before tanks are filled. If storage tanks leak or insulation fails, propellant boils off into the thin atmosphere, irrecoverable. Redundancy is limited by mass constraints. Spare parts must be chosen in advance and transported from Earth. Repairs require tools, expertise, and time. Not all failures can be anticipated. Not all repairs are possible with the materials at hand. The stakes of ISRU failure are absolute. Without fuel, the spacecraft cannot launch. Without launch, the crew cannot depart. Without departure, the crew remains on Mars indefinitely. There is no alternative launch site. There is no rescue mission capable of arriving within the time frame that life support can sustain. There is no option to wait for another shipment of fuel from Earth, as the transit time is measured in months and the logistics of landing additional cargo are themselves uncertain. The crew becomes dependent on the continuous functioning of systems that were never tested in the environment they now inhabit, that have no repair infrastructure beyond what was packed, and that must operate without failure for years. This is not a matter of redundancy or careful planning, reducing risk to acceptable levels. It is a matter of accepting that the cumulative probability of critical failure, given enough time and enough systems, trends towards certainty. Radiation exposure begins the moment a spacecraft leaves the protective cocoon of Earth's magnetosphere. In interplanetary space, there is no magnetic field to deflect charged particles. The sun emits a continuous stream of protons and electrons known as the solar wind. Occasionally, solar flares and coronal mass ejections release bursts of high-energy particles that can deliver dangerous doses in hours. Beyond the solar system, galactic cosmic rays, remnants of supernova, stream through space at nearly the speed of light. These particles are energetic enough to penetrate spacecraft hulls, spacesuits, and human tissue. As they pass through matter, they ionize atoms, breaking chemical bonds and damaging DNA. The damage is cumulative. Each particle traversal adds to the total dose. Over months of transit, doses accumulate to levels far exceeding what is considered safe for terrestrial radiation workers. Current spacecraft offer minimal shielding. Aluminum hulls provide some protection against lower energy particles, but are ineffective against high energy cosmic rays. Thick shielding is heavy, and mass is the enemy of propulsion. Water or polyethylene, rich in hydrogen, can attenuate some radiation, but requires substantial mass and volume. The result is that astronauts traveling to Mars will receive doses estimated between 50 and several hundred millisieverts for the outbound journey alone. Background radiation on Mars, lacking a magnetic field and with only a thin atmosphere, is higher than in interplanetary space because cosmic rays also generate secondary particles when they strike the Martian surface. Over an 18-month surface stay, additional radiation accumulates. The return journey adds another several months of exposure. Cumulative doses approach or exceed 1 sievert, a threshold associated with measurable increases in cancer risk, cataracts, cardiovascular disease, and central nervous system damage. Acute radiation sickness from a solar particle event is possible if a large flare occurs during extravehicular activity or in a lightly shielded area of the spacecraft. Symptoms include nausea, vomiting, fatigue, and immune suppression. Severe exposure can cause bone marrow failure and death. Even sublethal doses compromise the crew's ability to perform physically and cognitively demanding tasks. Long-term effects manifest years after exposure, but the biological damage begins immediately. DNA double-strand breaks are difficult for cells to repair correctly. Misrepairs lead to mutations. Some mutations are benign. Others initiate cancer. Increased cancer risk becomes a permanent condition, a biological scar carried for life. Cardiovascular damage from radiation includes accelerated atherosclerosis, an increased risk of heart attack and stroke, conditions that may emerge during the mission or upon return to Earth. Central nervous system damage affects cognition, memory, and emotional regulation. Studies on animals exposed to cosmic ray analogs show persistent deficits in learning and increased anxiety. These are not temporary impairments. They are changes to the structure and function of the brain. For astronauts already on Mars, radiation exposure is not merely a delayed risk. It is an ongoing degradation of health that reduces resilience, increases vulnerability to illness, and shortens lifespan. It adds to the compounding list of physiological insults that erode the body's capacity to endure the stresses of launch and return. It is one thread in a web of biological decline that collectively makes departure increasingly difficult and survival increasingly uncertain. Gravity on Mars is 38% of Earth's gravity. This reduction is not trivial. No. Human physiology evolved under one gravity. Bones, muscles, cardiovascular systems, and vestibular organs are calibrated to function under the constant downward pull of Earth's mass. Reduce that pull, and the body adapts by shedding what it no longer needs. Bone density decreases. Muscles atrophy. The heart, no longer required to pump blood against full gravity, becomes less efficient. These changes begin immediately upon arrival on Mars and continue throughout the surface stay. Astronauts on the International Space Station in microgravity lose bone density at a rate of 1 to 2% per month in weight-bearing bones such as the hips and spine. Muscle mass decreases despite aggressive exercise regimens. On Mars, gravity is not zero, but it is insufficient to prevent similar decline. The rate of bone loss on Mars is not precisely known because no human has yet lived there, but models and partial gravity studies suggest losses intermediate between Earth and microgravity. Over 18 months, bone density could decline by 20% or more. Muscles weaken proportionally. The cardiovascular system deconditions. Astronauts returning from 6-month stays on the ISS often cannot stand without assistance upon re-entry. They experience orthostatic intolerance, where blood pools in the legs and the heart cannot supply sufficient blood to the brain. Recovery takes weeks. Returning from Mars will involve not 18 months of microgravity, but 18 months of partial gravity, followed by a 6-month return journey in microgravity, followed by re-entry and immediate exposure to 1 full gravity. The cumulative physiological decline will be profound. Bone fractures become likely under the stresses of re-entry deceleration. Muscle weakness impairs the ability to move. to operate spacecraft controls to evacuate in an emergency. Cardiovascular collapse upon standing could render astronauts unable to perform essential tasks. Exercise countermeasures have limited effectiveness. On the ISS, astronauts exercise 2 hours per day using resistance machines and treadmills. Bone and muscle loss are slowed but not prevented. On Mars, exercise equipment must be transported, maintained, and powered. Space and mass are constrained. Ranks A. Equipment can fail. Motivation wanes under prolonged confinement and isolation. Even with perfect adherence, exercise in partial gravity does not replicate the loading conditions of Earth. The body adapts to the environment it inhabits. On Mars, that environment does not demand full bone density or full muscle strength. The body economizes, shedding tissue that requires energy to maintain but provides no functional advantage in the current context. This is efficient biology, but disastrous for return. The more time spent on Mars, the less capable the body becomes of surviving Earth gravity. The longer the wait for the return window, the deeper the physiological hole from which recovery must occur. Bone loss is not merely a matter of density. Bone is living tissue, constantly remodeled. Osteoclasts break down old bone. Osteoblasts build new bone. In microgravity and reduced gravity, the balance shifts toward breakdown. Bone architecture deteriorates. Trabeculae, the spongy internal structure of bones, thin and disappear. Bones become brittle. The risk of fracture increases. A fracture in space or on Mars is not a minor injury. Medical facilities are limited. Surgical intervention is impossible beyond basic field medicine. A fractured femur or pelvis could be fatal if it compromises mobility or damages blood vessels. Even non-fatal fractures produce pain, immobility, and risk of infection. Bone healing requires time, nutrition, and mechanical loading. On Mars, healing will be slower and less complete. Malunion or non-union of fractures can result in permanent disability. A disabled crew member is a liability in an environment where every person is essential and where evacuation is impossible. Muscle atrophy affects not only skeletal muscles, but also smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. The heart becomes smaller and weaker. Cardiac output decreases. The ability to respond to physical stress declines. Blood volume decreases as the body adjusts to reduced demand. Red blood cell production falls. Anemia develops. Oxygen carrying capacity diminishes. Endurance plummets. Tasks that were routine become exhausting. The compounding effects of muscle weakness, cardiovascular deconditioning, and anemia create a spiral of declining physical capacity. Each system supports the others. As each degrades, the load on the remaining systems increases, accelerating their decline. The vestibular system, responsible for balance and spatial orientation, relies on gravity to function. Inner ear structures detect acceleration and the direction of gravitational pull. In altered gravity, signals become unreliable. Spatial disorientation occurs. Motion sickness is common during the initial adaptation phase. Over time, the brain recalibrates, learning to interpret the new signals. Upon return to Earth gravity, recalibration must occur again. This transition is disorienting and can impair coordination at a time when precise control is critical. Re-entry and landing require astronauts to operate complex systems under high acceleration and stress. Disorientation increases the risk of errors. Errors during re-entry can be fatal. Errors during re-entry can be fatal. Vision changes observed in astronauts after long-duration spaceflight include flattening of the eyeball, swelling of the optic nerve, and changes in visual acuity. The mechanism is thought to involve fluid shifts and increased intracranial pressure in the absence of gravity. On Mars, with partial gravity, fluid shifts may be less severe than in microgravity, but are unlikely to be absent. Vision impairment affects the ability to perform tasks requiring fine visual discrimination, such as reading displays, conducting repairs, and piloting spacecraft. Deterioration in vision adds to the cumulative burden of physiological decline. Immune function is compromised in space. Studies of astronauts show reactivation of latent viruses such as Epstein-Barr and varicella-zoster, indicating suppressed immune surveillance. White blood cell counts change. Inflammatory markers increase. Inflammatory markers increase. The causes are multifactorial, including radiation, stress, altered sleep, and confinement. On Mars, these factors persist. Wound healing is slower. Risk of sepsis increases. A simple cut or abrasion, contaminated with Martian dust or bacteria from the habitat, could escalate into a life-threatening infection. The combination of bone loss, muscle atrophy, cardiovascular deconditioning, immune suppression, radiation damage, and sensory impairment creates a body progressively less capable of enduring the stresses required for return. Each day on Mars adds to the deficit. Each system decline interacts with others, compounding risk. There is no pause button. There is no medical intervention that can fully reverse these changes while still on Mars. The return journey, with its additional months of microgravity, further degrades physiology. By the time astronauts reach Earth orbit, they may be too weak to survive re-entry deceleration or to perform the actions necessary to egress the spacecraft and reach safety. The assumption that they will simply recover once back on Earth ignores the possibility that they may not survive the return trip or that the damage may be irreversible. Medical care on Mars will be rudimentary. No hospital, no operating room, no imaging equipment beyond perhaps portable ultrasound, no blood bank, no pharmacy stocked with more than a limited formulary, no specialists. Medical training for astronauts includes emergency procedures, but they are not surgeons, not radiologists, not anesthesiologists. A serious injury or sudden illness that would be survivable on Earth becomes a death sentence on Mars. Appendicitis, a routine surgical emergency on Earth, is fatal on Mars without the ability to perform an appendectomy. Intestinal obstruction, kidney stones, gallstones, pancreatitis, myocardial infarction, stroke, pulmonary embolism, pneumonia, sepsis, all conditions that occur with some frequency in healthy populations, are beyond the capacity of a small crew with limited supplies to treat effectively. The probability that no crew member will experience a serious medical event over 2.5 years is low. The consequence of such an event is likely death or permanent disability. Death on Mars presents its own problems. A body cannot be buried in Martian soil without contaminating the environment with Earth microbes, violating planetary protection protocols. Burial is also impractical given the hardness of frozen ground and the energy required to excavate. Sue? A body cannot be kept within the habitat indefinitely due to limited space and the psychological impact on surviving crew. Cremation requires high temperatures and fuel. Exposure on the surface preserves the body in the cold, dry atmosphere, but it becomes a persistent grim reminder and a potential source of contamination if scavengers or dust storms disturb it. The ethical and psychological burden of managing a crewmate's death, combined with the practical challenges, add to the stress and trauma endured by survivors. Knowing that death on Mars is irreversible and that bodies cannot be returned to Earth for burial further isolates the crew from any sense of connection to home. Psychological resilience is tested beyond any prior human experience. There is no possibility of physical return within the timescale of personal relationships. Conversations with loved ones are delayed by 20 minutes or more, depending on the planet's positions. Real-time interaction is impossible. The sense of being cut off from humanity is profound. The crew lives in a confined space, seeing the same faces, performing repetitive tasks under constant stress. Interpersonal conflicts, inevitable in any group, cannot be escaped. There is no privacy, no solitude beyond the interior of a bunk or suit. Beyond the interior of a bunk or suit. The landscape outside is barren, monotonous, and hostile. There is no rain, no wind that can be felt, no life, no change except the slow march of dust and the passage of seasons marked only by temperature and light. The psychological term for prolonged confinement in a dangerous, monotonous environment is isolation stress. Symptoms include depression, anxiety, irritability, cognitive decline, sleep disturbance, and interpersonal conflict. In extreme cases, psychosis, suicidal ideation, and violence can occur. On Earth, individuals experiencing severe psychological distress can be removed from the stressful environment and provided with treatment. On Mars, there is no removal. There is no psychiatric hospital. Therapeutic interventions are constrained by lack of trained personnel and privacy. A crew member in psychological crisis is both a victim and a potential threat to mission safety. Their ability to perform critical tasks is compromised. Their behavior may endanger others. Managing such a situation with limited resources and no possibility of external assistance places unbearable strain on the crew. The phenomenon of third-quarter syndrome observed in Antarctic winter over cruise and long-duration space missions describes a period roughly 3/4 through a mission when morale and performance decline sharply. The initial excitement has faded. The end is not yet in sight. The monotony becomes unbearable. For a Mars mission, the surface stay alone is 18 months. The total mission duration, including transit, exceeds 2.5 years. The midpoint arrives long before the return window opens. Amens. The third quarter may coincide with equipment failures, dwindling supplies, or medical crises, compounding stress. Recovery from third quarter syndrome relies on the prospect of returning home. Alma. If that prospect becomes uncertain, if the return window is missed or the return vehicle is damaged, the psychological foundation crumbles. Hope is the critical resource, more fragile than any hardware. Communication delay erodes the connection between crew and Earth. At Mars's closest approach, light takes roughly 4 minutes to travel between planets. Round-trip communication time is 8 minutes. At farthest distance, over 20 minutes one way, over 40 minutes round trip. Every question requires waiting nearly an hour for an answer. Real-time conversation is impossible. Mission control cannot provide immediate guidance during an emergency. Decisions must be made autonomously by the crew. Autonomy under routine conditions is manageable. Autonomy during a crisis, when stress impairs judgment, and when the consequences of error are fatal, is a different matter. The crew must be expert in every system, capable of diagnosing and repairing failures without external assistance, and able to make life and death decisions without the benefit of consultation. Training can prepare to a point, but no training can cover every possible failure mode or combination of failures. The crew will inevitably face situations for which they are unprepared. Their response will determine survival. The weight of that responsibility, combined with isolation and stress, is crushing. Dust on Mars is not like terrestrial dust. It is fine, abrasive, and electrostatically charged. Grains are irregularly shaped, with sharp edges formed by impact fracture rather than erosion by water or wind. The composition includes silicates, perchlorates, and metal oxides. When disturbed, dust becomes suspended in the thin atmosphere and clings to surfaces due to static charge. It infiltrates seals, bearings, and joints. It abrades moving parts. It accumulates on solar panels, reducing power generation. It coats radiators, impairing heat dissipation. It is brought into habitats on spacesuits and equipment despite airlocks and cleaning procedures. Inside, it becomes an inhalation hazard. Lunar dust, studied during the Apollo missions, caused respiratory irritation and equipment problems despite only brief surface stays. Martian dust, with its perchlorates, is chemically reactive and potentially toxic. Perchlorates interfere with thyroid function. Chronic exposure could lead to metabolic disorders. Inhalation of fine particulates causes inflammation in lung tissue. Chronic inflammation can lead to fibrosis and reduced lung capacity. There is no way to eliminate dust entirely. It is pervasive. Every surface operation generates it. Every entry into the habitat brings it inside. Over months and years, accumulation is inevitable. The health effects compound with other stressors. Equipment degradation accelerates. Filters clog. Seals wear. Mechanical failures increase. Dust is not dramatic. It does not strike like a meteor. It erodes slowly, imperceptibly, until systems fail and lungs sicken. Global dust storms on Mars occur irregularly, but can envelop the entire planet, blocking sunlight for weeks or months. Solar power drops to near zero. If the habitat and ISRU systems rely on solar power, operations must halt. Battery reserves are finite. Once depleted, life support systems fail. Temperature inside the habitat drops as heating systems shut down. Carbon dioxide scrubbing ceases. Oxygen generation stops. The crew has hours to days before the environment becomes unlivable. Backup power from nuclear sources can sustain critical systems, but nuclear power supplies have their own failure modes. Reactors require cooling. Cooling systems require power to pump coolant. Dust clogs cooling, fins, cooling, fins. If cooling fails, the reactor overheats and shuts down or, in a worst case, suffers a meltdown. Redundancy is limited by mass and cost. A single point of failure in the power system is catastrophic. Dust storms are predictable in a statistical sense. They occur most often during Martian summer, but their timing and severity are not precisely forecastable. A mission cannot simply avoid dust storm season. The stay is too long. The crew must endure at least one Martian year, which is nearly 2 Earth years. The probability of encountering a major dust storm is high. Survival depends on systems functioning under degraded conditions for extended periods. There is no margin for additional failures during the storm. Water is essential for life support, hygiene, and propellant production. On Mars, water exists as ice in the polar caps and in subsurface deposits at higher latitudes. Accessing it requires excavation or drilling, energy for heating ice to extract water, and purification to remove salts and perchlorates. Systems for water extraction must be transported, deployed, and maintained. Failure of water extraction jeopardizes the mission as critically as failure of ISRU propellant production. Water is heavy. Transporting sufficient water from Earth for the entire surface stay is impractical. The mission depends on local extraction. If extraction fails, rationing begins immediately. Humans require roughly 2 liters of water per day for drinking, more for hygiene and food preparation. Recycling life support water is possible, but not perfectly efficient. Losses occur. Contamination requires purging and replacement without a reliable local water source. Reserves dwindle. Dehydration impairs cognitive and physical function. Kidney stones become more likely, a painful and potentially dangerous condition without medical facilities. Death from dehydration occurs within days. Rationing can extend supplies, but only delays the inevitable. The mission becomes a countdown to exhaustion of water, with no resupply possible. Oxygen is generated by electrolysis of water or by processing Martian atmosphere. Electrolysis splits water into hydrogen and oxygen. Atmospheric processing separates carbon dioxide and extracts oxygen. Both require power and functioning equipment. Oxygen is consumed continuously by crew respiration and by burning for cooking or heating if necessary. Life support systems recycle air, removing carbon dioxide and replenishing oxygen. But recycling is not complete. Leaks, though small, accumulate. Oxygen must be continuously produced to compensate. Failure Near oxygen generation is immediately life-threatening. Humans lose consciousness within minutes at low oxygen levels and suffer brain damage or death shortly thereafter. Redundancy in oxygen systems is critical, but redundancy adds mass and complexity. Each backup system is another potential failure point. The interlocking dependencies of power, water, and oxygen create a fragile web. Failure in any one area cascades into others. A power failure stops water extraction and oxygen generation. A water shortage halts oxygen production by electrolysis and propellant production. An oxygen shortage threatens life immediately. The mission design assumes all systems function nominally. Reality includes wear, degradation, and unforeseen failures. Over time, the probability that all systems continue to function trends towards zero. Food supplies are finite. Resupply from Earth is not feasible on a timeline that matters. Food must be packed for the entire mission duration plus substantial margin. The mass is significant. Dehydrated and freeze-dried foods reduce weight but require water for preparation. Nutritional quality degrades over time. Vitamins break down. Taste and texture deteriorate. Psychological monotony of repetitive meals affects morale. Growing food on Mars is theoretically possible, but practically difficult. Plants require light, water, nutrients, carbon dioxide, and stable temperature. Martian soil is chemically unsuitable without extensive modification. Greenhouses must be pressurized, heated, and lit. Power demands are substantial. Crop failures due to equipment malfunction, disease, or contamination are likely. The effort and resources required to grow food may exceed the caloric return. Early missions will rely on stored food. Running out of food leads to starvation, a slow and agonizing death. Rationing extends supplies, but reduces caloric intake, impairing physical and cognitive performance, accelerating physiological decline, and reducing the ability to perform the labor-intensive tasks required for survival. Starvation weakens the immune system, making infection more likely. It impairs wound healing. It causes muscle wasting beyond that, already occurring due to reduced gravity. Astronauts arriving at the return window, malnourished and weakened, are less likely to survive the return journey. Temperature regulation in the habitat depends on insulation and active heating or cooling. Martian surface temperatures range from minus 125 Celsius at the poles in winter to 20 Celsius at the equator in summer. Diurnal swings are extreme due to thin atmosphere and lack of heat retention. Without heating, habitat interior temperatures would plummet at night. Without cooling, daytime temperatures could become uncomfortable or dangerous. Heating requires power. Cooling requires power. Both require functioning equipment. Thermal control systems can fail. Heaters burn out. Coolant pumps seize. Insulation degrades. A habitat that becomes too cold threatens hypothermia. A habitat that becomes too hot threatens hyperthermia. Either condition impairs crew function and, if prolonged, causes death. Spacesuits provide temporary refuge, but are not designed for continuous habitation. Suit life support is limited to hours. The crew cannot live in suits indefinitely. They depend on the habitat environment remaining within tolerable bounds. Any failure that compromises thermal control must be repaired immediately. Repairs in extreme temperatures are themselves dangerous. Cold makes materials brittle. Heat causes burns. Working outside the habitat in a suit is physically taxing and exposes the crew to radiation. Froni Ambri EVA carries risk. Accumulating EVA time increases total radiation dose and the probability of suit failure or injury. The Martian ascent vehicle must function after sitting on the surface for 18 months. It will have been exposed to temperature cycling, dust accumulation, potential micrometeorite impacts, and UV radiation. Seals may have degraded. Lubricants may have migrated or frozen. Electronics may have suffered radiation damage. Propellant tanks, even if insulated, experience thermal stress. Metal contracts and expands with temperature changes. Leak detection before launch is essential, but not foolproof. Systems that appear functional during pre-launch checks can fail under the stress of ignition and ascent. The ascent vehicle has no opportunity for a test flight. The first launch is the only launch. There is no abort to orbit option from the surface. If the engines fail to ignite, the mission is over. If thrust is insufficient, the vehicle crashes. If navigation fails, the vehicle does not reach the correct orbit. Rendezvous with an orbiting return stage, if mission architecture uses one, requires precise orbital insertion. Errors of meters per second in velocity or seconds in timing result in orbits that do not intersect. Without rendezvous, the crew is stranded in Martian orbit, a worse situation than being on the surface. Orbit provides no life support beyond what is in the ascent capsule. Oxygen and power are limited. Re-entry to Mars from orbit without a heat shield designed for it is not survivable. The crew would asphyxiate or freeze within hours. Assuming successful ascent and rendezvous or direct injection onto an Earth transfer trajectory, the return transit begins. The spacecraft has been in space or on Mars for over 2 years. Components have aged. Meteorite impacts may have caused damage. Radiation has degraded materials. The crew is physiologically compromised, malnourished, weakened, and psychologically exhausted. I-return journey is 6 months of microgravity. Bone and muscle loss continue. Radiation exposure accumulates. The spacecraft life support must function flawlessly. Any failure in oxygen generation, carbon dioxide removal, water recycling, or temperature control is fatal. There are no spare parts that were not packed initially. There is no possibility of repair using materials not already aboard. The spacecraft is a closed system hurtling through vacuum. Help cannot arrive. Communication delay means that advice from Earth is delayed by minutes to tens of minutes. The crew is alone. Re-entry into Earth's atmosphere is the most violent phase of the mission. The spacecraft strikes the upper atmosphere at 11 kilometers per second. Kinetic energy converts to heat. Temperatures on the heat shield reach thousands of degrees. Deceleration forces peak at several times Earth gravity. The crew, already weakened by years of reduced gravity and microgravity, must endure sustained high G-loading. Blood is forced toward the feet. The heart struggles to pump blood to the brain. Vision narrows and blacks out. Loss of consciousness is possible. If G forces exceed tolerance, crew members may suffer G-induced loss of consciousness, cerebral hemorrhage, or cardiac arrest. The spacecraft's trajectory and orientation must be precise. Errors result in either skipping off the atmosphere back into space, where the spacecraft has insufficient fuel to attempt re-entry again, or in too steep an angle, causing deceleration forces and heating that exceed design limits. Either scenario is fatal. Parachutes must deploy at the correct altitude and sequence. Failure of a parachute results in impact at lethal velocity. Landing systems must function. Airbags or retrorockets cushion final impact. Failure means a crash. After landing, the crew may be unable to egress without assistance. Muscle weakness and orthostatic intolerance may prevent standing or walking. If the landing site is remote, or if weather delays recovery, exposure and dehydration are risks. Rescue teams must reach the crew quickly. Unlike Apollo or Soyuz landings, which occur in well-defined zones with recovery forces standing by, a Mars return might land anywhere within a broad footprint due to uncertainties accumulated over months of flight. Search and rescue over large areas take time. The crew's survival depends on being found and extracted before life support in the capsule is exhausted. Each of these stages, surface stay, propellant production, ascent, transit, re-entry, recovery, presents multiple failure modes. Success requires every stage to succeed. The probability of mission success is the product of probabilities of each stage succeeding. If each stage has a 95% probability of success, which is optimistic given the unknowns and the harsh environment, 6 sequential stages yield a combined probability of approximately 74%. Real-world systems in untested environments have lower reliability. Historical space missions have experienced failure rates higher than anticipated. Apollo 13 survived due to heroic improvisation and support from Earth. On Mars, improvisation has limits. Support from Earth is advice, not physical assistance. The odds are not favorable. Mission planners speak of acceptable risk, but acceptable is a policy decision, not a physical reality. Astronauts accept risk, but acceptance does not reduce the probability of failure. The first crew to Mars is unlikely to be the last crew on Mars by choice. They are likely to be the last crew on Mars because they cannot leave. Consider the scenario in which a critical component of the ISRU system fails. Perhaps a compressor motor burns out due to dust infiltration and overheating. Replacement requires a spare motor, which may or may not have been packed. Assume a spare exists. Installation requires tools, knowledge of the system, and time. The crew must work in suits outside or in a minimally heated workshop. The repair is complex. Connections must be sealed perfectly. Testing must confirm function before full operation resumes. During the repair, propellant production is halted. The return window approaches. If production does not resume and reach the required fuel levels before the window, departure is impossible. Pressure mounts. Mistakes become more likely under stress. A mistake during repair could damage other components or injure a crew member. Even if the repair succeeds, the delay may have cost enough time that full propellant loads are not achieved. Launching with partial fuel means insufficient velocity for Earth transfer. The spacecraft either fails to escape Mars orbit or enters a trajectory that does not intercept Earth. The latter is worse than remaining on the surface. At least the surface has habitat and life support. A spacecraft on the wrong trajectory has only what is on board, with no destination and no rescue. Consider a medical emergency. A crew member suffers acute abdominal pain. Differential diagnosis includes appendicitis, kidney stone, bowel obstruction, or other causes. Without imaging, diagnosis is guesswork. Appendicitis requires surgery within hours to days to prevent rupture and peritonitis. The crew has no surgical training beyond emergency field procedures. Anesthesia options are limited. Sterile environment is difficult to achieve in a habitat not designed as an operating room. Performing an appendectomy with improvised tools and inadequate anesthesia is a desperate act with low probability of success and high probability of complications such as hemorrhage or infection. If surgery is not attempted, the appendix ruptures. Peritonitis ensues, sepsis develops. Death follows within days. The loss of a crew member reduces available labor for maintenance and operations. Morale collapses. The psychological impact of watching a colleague die slowly and painfully, knowing that on Earth the condition would be trivial, is traumatic. Survivor guilt and despair undermine the will to continue. Mission cohesion fractures. Remaining crew may lose focus or become paralyzed by fear. The mission's success depends on human performance as much as hardware. Break the humans, and the hardware becomes irrelevant. Consider the compounding effect of multiple minor failures. A solar panel cracks, reducing power by 10%. A water recycling filter clogs, reducing efficiency. A suit develops a slow leak, requiring more frequent patching. A crew member injures a knee, reducing their ability to perform EVA. A communication antenna loses alignment, increasing the bit error rate and reducing data throughput. No single failure is catastrophic, but together they erode margins. Power shortfall means rationing electricity, reducing heating or oxygen production. Water shortage means stricter rationing, impacting hygiene and morale. Suit issues increase the risk of EVA and limit the crew's ability to perform external maintenance. Reduced crew capability increases workload on others, causing fatigue and increasing error rates. Communication problems delay decision-making and reduce access to Earth-based expertise. The mission enters a spiral of degradation. Efforts to fix one problem consume resources needed elsewhere. Triage becomes necessary. Not all problems can be addressed. Some are deferred, hoping they do not worsen. Hope is not a strategy. Deferred problems tend to worsen. Systems depend on each other. Neglecting one area causes failures in others. The crew works harder, sleeps less, becomes more stressed. Cognitive performance declines. Mistakes multiply. A mistake leads to another failure, feeding the spiral. The assumption underlying the possibility of return is that the mission proceeds nominally. Nominal means everything works as designed, that the environment behaves as predicted, that the crew remains healthy and competent, that no unforeseen events occur. No mission in the history of spaceflight has proceeded entirely nominally. Apollo 11 had alarms during lunar descent. Apollo 13 suffered an explosion. Space shuttle missions experienced tile damage, sensor failures, and computer glitches. The International Space Station has endured coolant leaks, oxygen generator failures, and ammonia pump breakdowns. These missions succeeded because they were in low Earth orbit, or in Apollo's case, only days from Earth, with extensive real-time support. Mars missions have no such safety net. They are isolated by time, distance, and communication delay. They depend on pre-positioned resources and equipment functioning after prolonged exposure to an environment never before inhabited by humans. The likelihood that everything will work as planned is negligible. The question is not whether failures will occur, but whether they can be managed. The answer depends on redundancy, spare parts, crew skill, and luck. Redundancy is limited by mass. Spare parts must be anticipated, and not all failure modes can be foreseen. Crew skill is high but finite. Luck is not controllable. The psychological concept of learned helplessness describes a state where individuals, after repeated exposure to uncontrollable, stressful events, stop attempting to change their situation even when opportunities arise. On Mars, the environment is fundamentally uncontrollable. Dust storms arrive without warning. Equipment fails despite maintenance. Radiation doses accumulate regardless of shielding. The landscape offers no comfort or variety. Efforts to improve the situation yield marginal returns. The crew is smart enough to calculate the odds. They understand the precariousness of their position. Over time, the realization that their fate is largely out of their hands may lead to passivity, depression, and withdrawal. Mission commanders will attempt to maintain morale through routine, goals, and group cohesion, but these tools have limits. The absence of a clear, achievable path to safety erodes motivation. If the return window is missed or the return vehicle is known to be inoperable, learned helplessness can set in completely. Why continue struggling to survive if survival only prolongs suffering with no possibility of escape? Some crew members may become suicidal. Others may become reckless, taking unnecessary risks. Group dynamics can become toxic. Blame and scapegoating emerge. The mission disintegrates not because of hardware failure, but because the human element breaks. The ethical implications of a one-way mission are profound. If space agencies and planners know or suspect that return is unlikely, sending astronauts anyway raises questions of informed consent and the value placed on human life. Astronauts are volunteers, aware of risks, but awareness of risk is not the same as certainty of death. Framing the mission as dangerous but survivable, when analysis suggests survival is improbable, is deceptive. It transforms exploration into a suicide mission. Society's willingness to accept such missions reflects values about heroism, sacrifice, and the pursuit of knowledge. History offers examples of explorers who did not return, celebrated as martyrs. Yet those were often missions where the risks were underestimated or where no alternative existed. For Mars, alternatives include robotic exploration, which has proven highly effective, or delaying human missions until technology and knowledge reduce risks to acceptable levels. Rushing to send humans for political or symbolic reasons, knowing they will likely die or be stranded, is difficult to justify ethically. From a practical standpoint, the loss or stranding of the first crew would damage public support for space exploration. The images of astronauts dying on another planet, broadcast across media, would be traumatic for global audiences. Political will for subsequent missions would evaporate. Funding would be cut. The dream of becoming a multiplanetary species would suffer a setback measured in decades. Conversely, if the risks are downplayed and the mission proceeds with public expectation of success, the eventual failure would be seen as a betrayal. Trust in space agencies would collapse. Either way, the consequences of a failed return extend beyond the individuals involved. They affect the trajectory of human spaceflight and the cultural narrative around exploration. Launch windows impose rigid timelines. Departure from Mars must occur within a window lasting weeks. Miss it, and the next window is 26 months away. As the window approaches, any unresolved issues create pressure to launch regardless. The temptation to take risks, to launch with marginal fuel levels or with unrepaired systems, is enormous. The alternative is 2 more years on Mars, consuming resources, aging hardware, declining health. The decision to launch or wait is agonizing. Launch with insufficient fuel, and the trajectory may not reach Earth. The crew dies in space. Wait, and conditions may worsen to the point where even the next window cannot be met. There is no good choice, only less bad options. The decision rests with the crew, as communication delay prevents real-time consultation with Earth. Whatever they decide, they live or die with the consequences. Orbital mechanics are unforgiving. A spacecraft must achieve a specific velocity and direction to enter the desired trajectory. Velocity errors of tens of meters per second translate to missing Earth by millions of kilometers. Navigation requires precise knowledge of spacecraft position and velocity, obtained through tracking and onboard sensors. Sensors can fail or provide erroneous data. Star trackers can be blinded by sun glare or contamination. Accelerometers drift. Gyroscopes fail. Course corrections require propellant. If propellant reserves are low, corrections are limited. The spacecraft may lack the fuel to adjust trajectory if errors accumulate. Flying a ballistic trajectory with no margin for correction is gambling that everything was perfect during the initial burn. Perfect is a standard that engineering rarely achieves. Communication blackout during re-entry lasts several minutes as ionized plasma surrounding the spacecraft blocks radio signals. During blackout, the crew and mission control are blind. If something goes wrong, there is no time to react. The spacecraft is committed to its trajectory. The heat shield must hold. The structure must withstand aerodynamic forces. Parachutes must deploy on schedule. Any failure is invisible until the spacecraft either emerges from blackout or does not. Recovery teams wait, listening for a signal. Silence means failure. The minutes of blackout are the longest of the mission. For the crew, it is a descent into uncertainty, unable to communicate, unable to alter course, trusting that systems designed and built years earlier, tested in simulations, but never in the actual environment of Mars return, will function as intended. Trust is all they have. Assuming successful landing, the crew faces immediate medical evaluation. Years of radiation exposure have increased cancer risk, but cancers may not manifest for years. Bone density is assessed. Fractures are possible even from the act of standing. Muscle atrophy requires months of rehabilitation. Cardiovascular reconditioning takes time. Vision changes may be permanent. Immune function slowly recovers. Psychological trauma requires therapy. Some astronauts may never fully recover physically or mentally. The long-term health consequences become a lifelong burden. They are survivors, but survival comes at a cost. Their bodies are damaged in ways that will affect quality of life and lifespan. They may face chronic pain, disability, and increased mortality from cancer and cardiovascular disease. The return to Earth does not erase what Mars did to them. Yet even this outcome, painful as it is, assumes return occurs. The premise we examine is that return will not occur. The first crew will not return because the cumulative obstacles are insurmountable. Not because of a single catastrophic failure, though that is possible, but because the aggregate of small degradations, resource limitations, physiological decline, and mechanical wear reaches a point where the systems and bodies required for departure no longer exist in functional form. The mission becomes survival rather than exploration. The focus shifts from achieving objectives to yanchanging life. Eventually, resources are exhausted. Spare parts run out. Food supplies dwindle. Water extraction fails. Power systems degrade beyond repair. Life support falters. The crew faces the reality that no rescue is coming, that Earth is unreachable, that they will die on Mars. How they face that reality varies. Some may find meaning in their situation, documenting their experiences, conducting final observations, leaving a legacy. Others may despair. The last communications with Earth will be farewells. Eventually, the signals stop. The habitat falls silent. The bodies remain, preserved in the cold, dry atmosphere. Monuments to ambition and the limits of human endurance. The Martian environment does not forgive error. It does not provide resources easily. It does not cushion failure. Every human need must be met by systems designed, built, and transported from Earth. Every failure must be repaired with limited tools and materials. Every day is a test of endurance. The planet's hostility is passive but relentless. It does not attack. It simply exists in a state incompatible with human life. Humans adapt environments to suit their needs. On Mars, the ability to adapt the environment is constrained by energy, materials, and knowledge. The Martian atmosphere cannot be breathed. The water is locked in ice or chemically bound in minerals. The soil is toxic. The temperature kills, the radiation penetrates, the dust invades, the distance isolates. Humans are not adapted to Mars. Evolution shaped us for Earth. Placing humans on Mars is placing them in an environment fundamentally alien to their biology. Survival requires constant technological intervention. When technology fails, biology fails quickly. The idea of colonizing Mars, of establishing a permanent human presence, assumes that these challenges can be overcome through iteration, through learning from failures, through building infrastructure over time. Perhaps eventually, with enough investment and enough time, Mars could be made marginally more habitable. Underground habitats protected from radiation, extensive life support and manufacturing, large populations providing redundancy and specialized skills. But this vision is distant. The first missions will not have such infrastructure. They will be small, isolated, and fragile. The first crews are pioneers, but pioneers often die. The successful colonization of hostile environments on Earth involved large numbers of people, supply lines, and the ability to retreat or receive help. Mars offers none of these. The first crew is an experiment. The hypothesis is that humans can live and return from Mars. The null hypothesis is that they cannot. Testing the hypothesis risks lives. The outcome will inform future decisions, but for the individuals involved, there is no second chance. The economic cost of Mars missions is staggering. Estimates range from hundreds of billions to over $1 trillion for a crewed mission, depending on architecture and assumptions. This cost must be justified against alternative uses of resources. Robotic missions provide scientific return at a fraction of the cost and risk. Human missions are justified on the basis of inspiration, national prestige, and the long-term goal of becoming multiplanetary. These justifications are subjective. Inspiration does not require human presence on Mars. It can be derived from robotic achievements. National prestige is ephemeral and costly. The goal of becoming multiplanetary is aspirational, but does not require immediate crewed missions. The rush to send humans to Mars before technology and knowledge are sufficient may result in tragedy that sets back the goal rather than advancing it. Patience and continued robotic exploration, coupled with development of enabling technologies such as advanced propulsion, closed loop life support, and artificial gravity, would increase the probability of success. The political and cultural forces driving human Mars missions often prioritize timelines over safety. Deadlines create pressure to launch before readiness. History shows that schedule pressure contributes to accidents. Space Shuttle Challenger was launched despite concerns about O-ring performance in cold temperatures because of schedule pressure. Columbia's destruction was preceded by years of normalization of deviance, accepting risks that should have been unacceptable. Mars missions will face similar pressures. The temptation to proceed despite unresolved concerns, to accept higher risk in order to meet announced timelines, is strong. The consequence of yielding to that temptation is the preventable death of astronauts. Technical solutions to some problems exist in theory. Advanced propulsion systems such as nuclear thermal rockets could reduce transit time, lowering radiation exposure and mission duration. Artificial gravity generated by rotating spacecraft could mitigate bone and muscle loss. Improved radiation shielding using hydrogen-rich materials or active magnetic fields could reduce doses. More capable ISRU systems with greater redundancy could improve reliability. Larger crews provide more skills and labor. Extensive pre-positioning of supplies and equipment reduces dependence on single-point failures. Each solution adds cost, complexity, and development time. Some technologies are not yet mature. Nuclear thermal propulsion has been studied for decades but not flown. Rotating artificial gravity spacecraft require large structures and precise control. Active radiation shielding requires enormous power. Even with these technologies, risks remain. Mars is inherently dangerous. Technology reduces risk but does not eliminate it. The question is whether risk is reduced to an acceptable level and what acceptable means when lives are at stake. The narrative of exploration often emphasizes triumph over adversity, human ingenuity, and the expansion of knowledge. These are real and valuable, but the narrative can obscure the costs. Explorers who die are remembered as heroes, but they are also dead. Their families grieve. Their potential is lost. The knowledge gained must be weighed against the price paid. When exploration is voluntary and informed, individuals make their own assessment of value versus risk. When exploration is driven by national or corporate interests, the voluntariness and informed nature of consent can be questioned. Are astronauts truly free to decline missions when careers and identities are bound to participation? Are they fully informed of risks when uncertainties are downplayed to secure funding or maintain morale? These questions do not have clear answers, but must be considered. The international nature of space exploration introduces additional complexity. Cooperation spreads cost and risk, but also complicates decision-making. Different nations have different risk tolerances, regulatory frameworks, and political pressures. A joint mission must navigate these differences. Disagreements over whether to proceed with a launch, how to respond to failures, or how to allocate resources can paralyze decision-making. Communication across time zones and languages adds friction. In a crisis, swift decisions are necessary. Committee decision-making is slow. The command structure must be clear, but in international missions, command authority is often shared or ambiguous. These organizational challenges compound technical and physiological ones. Liability for failure is another consideration. If a Mars mission results in the death of crew, who is responsible? The space agency that organized the mission? The contractors who built faulty hardware? The politicians who imposed unrealistic schedules? The astronauts who accepted the mission? Liability is diffuse, making accountability difficult. Families of deceased astronauts may seek justice and answers. Investigations are conducted, but they cannot reverse outcomes. Lessons learned inform future missions, but they are written in blood. The first crew's failure becomes a case study, their mistakes and misfortunes dissected. Their humanity is reduced to data points. The concept of acceptable loss pervades discussions of risky endeavors. Military operations, dangerous professions, and extreme sports all involve accepted levels of risk. Society tolerates some loss in pursuit of goals deemed worthwhile. Space exploration fits this pattern. But what level of loss is acceptable? If the first Mars crew dies, is that an acceptable price? If multiple missions fail, when does the cost become unacceptable? These are moral questions without objective answers. They depend on values, on how much weight is given to human life versus exploration, on whether the deaths are seen as noble sacrifices or preventable tragedies. Public opinion shapes these judgments, and public opinion is fickle, influenced by media narratives, political rhetoric, and emotional responses. Consider the perspective of the astronauts themselves. They train for years, dedicating their lives to the mission. They are aware of risks but believe in the mission's importance. They trust the technology and their own abilities. They accept that they may not return, but they do not dwell on that possibility. To dwell on death is to invite fear that undermines performance. They focus on tasks, on objectives, on the incremental progress toward launch. Once on Mars, they confront reality. The abstract risks become concrete problems. The trust they placed in technology is tested daily. Equipment fails. Bodies weaken. The realization that return is uncertain or impossible arrives gradually or suddenly, depending on events. Their response is shaped by personality, training, and group dynamics. Some remain focused and productive, others struggle. The mission continues because stopping is not an option. There is nowhere to go, nothing else to do. They maintain routines, perform experiments, repair systems, because purpose staves off despair. When return is no longer possible, purpose becomes survival. When survival is no longer possible, purpose becomes legacy. They record observations, write messages, try to ensure that their experiences contribute to future missions. In their final moments, they hope that they are not forgotten, that their sacrifice means something. Whether it does is a question for those who remain on Earth. The images transmitted from Mars, of habitats covered in dust, of barren landscapes, of Earthrise never seen because Earth is a pale star in the Martian sky, will haunt human consciousness. The silence that follows the end of transmissions will be profound. The knowledge that human beings are dying or have died on another world, unreachable and unrescuable, challenges the notion that exploration is always progress. It forces confrontation with limits, with the reality that some places are too hostile, some distances too vast, some challenges too great for current capabilities. This confrontation can lead to wisdom, to patience, to investment in the long-term development of necessary technologies. Or it can lead to retreat, to abandonment of dreams, to the conclusion that humans are meant to remain on Earth. Either response shapes the future of the species. The resources required for Mars missions are vast, and resources are finite. Every dollar spent on Mars is a dollar not spent on addressing terrestrial problems such as poverty, disease, climate change, or education. The opportunity cost is real. Advocates argue that space exploration drives technological innovation with spillover benefits, and that diversifying human presence reduces existential risk. Critics argue that resources should address immediate human suffering rather than speculative long-term goals. Both positions have merit. The debate is fundamentally about priorities and values. What is certain is that sending astronauts to die on Mars will intensify this debate. The expenditure will be scrutinized. The justification will be questioned. If the mission fails to return, the critique will be harsh. If subsequent missions are canceled in response, the investment yields no continued return. The first crew's fate determines whether Mars exploration accelerates or halts. The technical literature on Mars mission architectures spans decades. Studies by NASA, ESA, private companies, and academic institutions have explored countless variations: direct return versus orbit rendezvous, chemical versus nuclear propulsion, pre-position supplies versus minimal infrastructure, short stays versus long stays, one-way versus round trip. Each architecture has trade-offs. None eliminates risk. All depend on assumptions about technology readiness, cost, and acceptable risk. The assumptions are often optimistic. Cost estimates historically underestimate actual expenditures. Technology development timelines slip. Risks that appear manageable in simulation prove challenging in reality. The gap between plan and execution is where missions fail. The Martian day, or SOL, is approximately 24 hours and 40 minutes. The slight difference from Earth's day disrupts circadian rhythms. Sleep quality declines, fatigue accumulates. Over months, the misalignment affects mood, cognition, and health. Shift work on Earth shows similar effects, including increased risk of cardiovascular disease, depression, and metabolic disorders. On Mars, the crew cannot adjust lighting to simulate Earth's day because power is constrained and because adherence to Martian time is necessary for coordinating solar-dependent operations. The chronic circadian disruption is another stressor compounding others. Micrometeorites strike spacecraft and surface structures continuously. Most are tiny, causing minor pitting and degradation. Occasionally, larger impacts penetrate. A micrometeorite puncture of a habitat wall causes depressurization. Alarms sound. The crew must locate and seal the breach before atmospheric pressure drops fatally. Sealant materials are finite. A large breach or multiple breaches could exceed repair capacity. Depressurization is rapid and catastrophic. Humans lose consciousness within seconds in vacuum. Death follows in minutes. If the crew is suited, they survive, but the habitat is compromised. Living in suits full-time is not sustainable. Life support duration is hours. The habitat must be repaired or abandoned. Abandoning the habitat means losing life support infrastructure, supplies, and shelter. The mission becomes a countdown to oxygen depletion. Micrometeorite risk is statistical. It cannot be predicted exactly, only estimated. The longer the surface stay, the higher the cumulative risk of a critical impact. Solar flares are eruptions of energy and particles from the sun. Large flares release radiation equivalent to billions of nuclear bombs. Flare warnings from solar observatories provide hours to days of notice, depending on flare speed. Upon warning, the crew must take shelter in shielded areas. Shelters are small, cramped spaces surrounded by water or regolith for shielding. The crew waits, confined, for hours to days until radiation levels drop. Flares are unpredictable. A particularly large event could occur with little warning or during EVA. Radiation from a major flare can cause acute sickness, skin burns, and increased long-term cancer risk. No shielding is perfect. Even sheltered, the crew receives some dose. Flares are a wild card, a risk that cannot be controlled, only endured. Redundancy in critical systems is the standard approach to reliability. 2 or 3 backups mean that multiple failures are required before a function is lost. But redundancy has limits. Backups add mass, volume, and cost. Not every component can be redundant. Some systems are inherently single string. Structural elements, pressure vessels, and primary habitat modules have no backups. Their failure is mission-ending. Even with redundancy, common mode failures can defeat backups. A design flaw affects all units. An environmental factor, such as dust or temperature, affects all units similarly. Redundancy assumes independent failures, but failures are often correlated. A power surge damages all electronics simultaneously. A contamination event affects all filters. A procedural error is repeated across systems. The reliability models used in mission planning assume independence that may not reflect reality. Testing spacecraft and equipment for Mars conditions is done in simulation. Vacuum chambers, thermal chambers, and radiation sources approximate the environment. But simulations are imperfect. Martian dust is not precisely replicable. Long-duration exposure cannot be fully tested within development schedules. Some failure modes only appear after months or years of operation. Testing is limited by cost and time. Decisions are made with incomplete information. Risks are accepted because exhaustive testing is impractical. The first real test is the mission itself. The crew are test subjects. The equipment is prototype. This reality is acknowledged, but not emphasized. The language used is confident, describing proven systems and rigorous testing. The subtext is that gaps remain, that unknowns exist, that fingers are crossed. Human factors engineering addresses the design of systems to match human capabilities and limitations. Controls must be reachable, displays readable, tasks achievable within human strength and dexterity. In space, these factors are altered. Reach is extended in microgravity but hampered by suits. Displays must be readable through helmet visors. Tasks requiring fine motor control are difficult in gloves. Fatigue and stress impair performance. Designers attempt to account for these factors, but the complexity of interactions between human and machine in extreme environments means that some tasks will be harder than anticipated, some controls less intuitive, some failures more difficult to diagnose. Astronauts adapt and improvise, but adaptation has limits. When multiple systems fail simultaneously, when time is short, when stress is high, human performance degrades. Errors occur. Errors in space are often fatal. The cultural context of Mars missions includes science fiction, which has imagined Mars exploration for over a century. The fictional Mars is often romanticized, a frontier for adventure and discovery. Reality is harsher. The disconnect between fiction and reality shapes public expectations. People expect missions to succeed because in stories they usually do. Failures are dramatic but overcome. Heroes persevere. Reality includes inglorious deaths from equipment malfunction, disease, or miscalculation. There are no dramatic rescues across interplanetary distances. There is no suspenseful last-minute solution. There is only the slow or sudden recognition that the mission has failed and that the crew will not return. Managing public expectations is part of mission communication strategy, but no strategy can fully prepare people for the reality of astronauts dying far from home, their pleas for help unanswered not from neglect, but from impossibility. Children watching the mission will form impressions about space, about risk, about the value of exploration. A successful return inspires the next generation of scientists and engineers. A failure teaches caution or fear. Educational systems use space missions as teaching moments. The lessons drawn depend on outcomes. If the first Mars crew dies, educators face the challenge of explaining why the mission was undertaken, what went wrong, and what it means for the future. Some will frame it as tragic but necessary risk, others as preventable folly. The narrative becomes contested, politicized, used to support various agendas. The astronauts become symbols, their individuality lost in the abstraction of debate. Economics of space missions involve not only direct costs, but also broader impacts. Jobs are created in aerospace industries. Technologies developed for space find applications on Earth. International cooperation fosters diplomatic relationships. These indirect benefits are cited to justify expenditure. However, the benefits are diffuse and difficult to quantify. The correlation between space spending and technological innovation is not straightforward. Many innovations arise from other sources. The claim that space programs drive innovation is partially true, but easily overstated. The diplomatic benefits of cooperation are real, but must be weighed against the costs. A failed mission can strain relationships as much as a successful one strengthens them. Partners may blame each other for failures. Investigations can become accusatory. The goodwill generated by cooperation can evaporate in recrimination. Insurance for space missions is a complex issue. Spacecraft and launch vehicles are insured, but insuring human life in space is problematic. Standard life insurance policies exclude spaceflight. Special policies for astronauts exist, but with high premiums and limited coverage. For Mars missions, the risk is so high that insurance may be unavailable or prohibitively expensive. Agencies self-insure or accept the risk. Financial compensation to families of deceased astronauts is provided through government programs, but no amount of money replaces a lost loved one. The financial dimension is a sidebar to the human tragedy, but reflects the calculated risk inherent in sending people to Mars. Legal frameworks for space activities are governed by international treaties, primarily the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. The treaty establishes principles such as the peaceful use of space, prohibition of weapons of mass destruction in space, and liability for damage caused by space objects. It does not directly address issues of criminal jurisdiction, property rights, or the rights of astronauts on other planets. As missions become more complex, gaps in the legal framework become apparent. If a crime occurs on Mars, which nation's laws apply? If a crew member must be restrained for safety, under what authority? If resources are extracted, who owns them? These questions are being addressed in ongoing discussions, but consensus is slow. Legal ambiguity adds uncertainty to missions. Clear rules provide structure and predictability. Ambiguity requires ad hoc decisions, increasing risk of disputes. The biological contamination of Mars with Earth microbes is a concern of planetary protection. Spacecraft and equipment are sterilized to the extent possible, but complete sterilization is impractical. Some microbes survive sterilization procedures. Humans carry trillions of microbes in and on their bodies. Despite precautions, microbial transfer to Mars is inevitable. If Earth microbes establish themselves on Mars, they could alter any existing Martian ecosystem, confound the search for native life, and violate planetary protection protocols. The ethical question is whether humans have the right to contaminate another planet. The practical question is whether contamination hinders scientific objectives. These concerns are secondary to crew survival, but remain part of the broader mission context. Resource extraction on Mars, if successful, opens possibilities for manufacturing and construction using local materials. Regolith can be sintered or melted to form bricks. Metals can be extracted from ores. Water provides hydrogen and oxygen. With sufficient energy and equipment, a wide range of materials can be produced. This in situ manufacturing reduces dependence on Earth supply and enables expansion of infrastructure. But early missions lack the capacity for significant manufacturing. The equipment required is massive, complex, and power-hungry. Small-scale experiments may demonstrate feasibility, but production at scales necessary to support habitats and propellant plants is beyond early mission scope. Manufacturing capability grows over multiple missions, assuming success and continued investment. The first crew will not benefit from mature in situ manufacturing. They will depend almost entirely on what they brought, with minimal ability to fabricate new components. The psychological phenomenon of overview effect describes a cognitive shift reported by astronauts who see Earth from space. The perspective of the planet as a fragile, borderless sphere floating in the void fosters a sense of unity and environmental awareness. Mars astronauts will not experience the overview effect in the same way. Earth from Mars is a point of light, not a visible sphere. The emotional impact is different. Instead of unity, they may feel isolation. Instead of awe, loneliness. The psychological effects of being the first humans to view Earth as just another star are unknown. It may deepen existential reflection or precipitate existential crisis. The crew will see two worlds, neither of which they can reach easily. Earth is home, but unreachable for years. Mars is present, but hostile. The sense of being between worlds, belonging to neither, could be profoundly disorienting. Communication with Earth provides a thread of connection, but the delay frays that thread. Conversations are asynchronous. Video messages are sent and responses received hours later. The sense of real-time interaction is lost. Relationships with family and friends become strained. Life on Earth continues without the astronauts. Loved ones experience events, make decisions, change. The astronauts are absent, unable to participate. They watch from a distance, informed but not involved. Marriages may falter under the strain. Children grow up with a parent absent. The astronauts miss births, deaths, celebrations, crises. The emotional toll is immense. Some astronauts on long-duration ISS missions report feeling disconnected from life on Earth, a sense that life moved on without them. On Mars, this disconnection is amplified by distance and duration. The psychological cost of this disconnection adds to the burden. The cumulative effect of all stressors, physical, psychological, social, environmental, is synergistic. Each stressor amplifies the impact of others. Radiation weakens the immune system, making infections more likely. Infections cause fatigue. reducing exercise adherence, accelerating bone and muscle loss. Bone loss increases fracture risk, limiting activity, further reducing loading, and worsening loss. Psychological stress impairs sleep, reducing cognitive function, increasing errors, causing accidents and equipment damage. Equipment damage requires repairs, increasing workload, causing more stress. The feedback loops are negative, driving a downward spiral. Breaking the spiral requires external input, fresh supplies, new equipment, medical intervention, or rescue, all of which are unavailable. The crew must halt the decline using only internal resources. Willpower, teamwork, and ingenuity can accomplish much, but they cannot manufacture spare parts, regenerate bone, or reverse radiation damage. The crew can slow the decline, but not stop it. Time is the enemy. Every day on Mars is another day of exposure, degradation, and resource consumption. The longer they wait for the return window, the worse their condition becomes. If the window is missed, the next wait is even longer, and the condition deteriorates further. Eventually, a threshold is crossed beyond which return is physically impossible, even if a vehicle is available. The body can no longer endure launch forces. The mind can no longer execute complex tasks. The mission ends not with a decision, but with an incapacity. The concept of point of no return in aviation refers to the point in a flight where continuing to the destination is safer or more feasible than turning back. For Mars missions, the point of no return occurs at launch from Earth. Once the spacecraft is en route, turning back is not possible. The trajectory is committed. Upon arrival, every passing day moves the crew further from the point where return is feasible. Initially, return is theoretically possible but challenging. As time passes, fuel must be produced, health declines, equipment ages, and the probability of successful return decreases. At some point, return becomes impossible. That point may not be recognizable until it has passed. The crew may believe return is still possible when in fact too many systems have failed, too much health has declined, too many resources have been exhausted. The realization comes too late. The window closes. They are trapped not by a sudden event, but by the accumulation of incremental losses. Mars itself is indifferent. It is a planet, a mass of rock and ice orbiting the sun, governed by physics. It has no intent, no malice, no awareness. The hostility is not active, but inherent in its properties. Humans impose meaning on it, see it as a challenge or a frontier. The planet simply exists. It will continue to exist long after any human presence has vanished. The traces left by the first crew, footprints, habitats, equipment, will eventually be eroded by wind and covered by dust. In geological time, they are ephemeral. The significance of the mission is entirely human. The tragedy, if it occurs, is a human tragedy, meaningful to humans, irrelevant to the universe. This perspective can be comforting or terrifying. It reduces individual suffering to insignificance, but also strips it of any redemptive meaning. The crew's deaths do not serve a cosmic purpose. They are accidents of biology attempting to exist where it is not adapted. The universe does not care. Only humans care. The weight of caring falls on those who sent the mission, those who supported it, and those who remember it. Alternative mission architectures include one-way missions with no intention of return. Volunteers would travel to Mars to establish a permanent settlement, living out their lives there. This approach eliminates the challenge and cost of return propulsion. Supplies and additional crew could be sent on subsequent missions, gradually building infrastructure. Ethically, one-way missions are controversial. They require participants to accept certain death on Mars, though potentially after years or decades of productive life. Selection criteria would differ, favoring older individuals or those without dependents. The psychological profile must accept finality and find purpose in contribution rather than return. Such missions have been proposed by organizations like Mars One, though none have materialized. The concept raises profound questions about the value of life, the ethics of suicide missions, and what society owes to volunteers. If return is truly impossible, then arguably a one-way mission is more honest than a round-trip mission that becomes one-way due to failure. Transparency about the nature of the mission allows informed consent. Deception or false hope undermines autonomy. The technological development required for safe Mars missions includes advances in multiple domains. Propulsion systems must become more efficient and reliable. Life support must achieve closed-loop recycling with minimal resupply. Medical capabilities must expand to handle a wider range of conditions autonomously. Radiation shielding must improve. Construction techniques using local materials must be developed. Energy generation must be robust against dust and environmental extremes. Manufacturing and repair capabilities must advance. Each domain requires research, testing, and iteration. Progress is incremental. Rushing development risks deploying immature technology. The pressure to meet political timelines or to beat competitors incentivizes risk-taking. Historical precedents show that cutting corners leads to disasters. Apollo 1 fire resulted from design choices prioritizing schedule over safety. Challenger and Columbia were lost due to systemic issues exacerbated by schedule pressure. Mars missions face similar risks. The timeline for development should be driven by readiness, not arbitrary deadlines. Political realities often conflict with this principle. Funding is tied to milestones and schedules. Delays result in budget cuts. The incentive is to declare readiness and proceed. The astronauts pay the price for premature commitment. Public engagement with space missions is highest during dramatic events, launches, landings, crises. Routine operations receive little attention. A Mars mission will captivate public interest initially. Media coverage will be extensive. As the mission progresses and routine sets in, attention wanes. People return to daily concerns. The astronauts become background noise. If a crisis occurs, attention surges again. The drama of life and death in space is compelling. Media thrives on it. The crew's suffering becomes entertainment, their fate a topic of speculation and debate. The ethical implications of consuming others' tragedy as spectacle are uncomfortable. Yet human nature gravitates towards stories of conflict and survival. The astronauts are aware that their lives are being watched. Privacy is non-existent. Every communication may be broadcast. The performance pressure adds to stress. They must maintain composure, project confidence, avoid revealing fear or despair. Authenticity is suppressed in favor of image management. The psychological cost of this performance is rarely discussed, but is real. Historical analogs to Mars missions include Antarctic expeditions, particularly those of the heroic age of exploration in the early 20th century. Expeditions led by Scott, Shackleton, and Amundsen faced extreme cold, isolation, and limited supplies. Some succeeded, others ended in tragedy. Scott's party reached the South Pole but died on the return journey due to cold, starvation, and exhaustion. Shackleton's endurance expedition survived against incredible odds through leadership and resourcefulness after their ship was crushed by ice. These stories are celebrated as examples of human courage and endurance. They are also cautionary tales about the limits of preparation and the role of luck. Mars missions resemble these expeditions in ambition and risk, but differ in scale and isolation. Antarctic expeditions could be resupplied, though with difficulty. Communication, if available, had shorter delays. Rescue, while difficult, was within the realm of possibility. Mars offers none of these. The analogy is useful but imperfect. Mars is more isolating, more hostile, and less forgiving. The economic model of space exploration has shifted with the involvement of private companies. Entities like SpaceX, Blue Origin, and others pursue commercial spaceflight and have announced ambitions for Mars. Private funding introduces different incentives. Profit, competition, and innovation drive private efforts. Regulation is lighter, allowing faster iteration, but also greater risk. Private companies may accept higher risk levels than government agencies, which are accountable to public scrutiny and political oversight. This difference can accelerate progress, but also increases the likelihood of failure. A private mission that results in deaths raises questions of liability and regulation. Should governments allow private entities to send people to Mars on high-risk missions? What duty of care exists? The evolving regulatory landscape struggles to keep pace with technological and commercial developments. The scientific return from crewed Mars missions is often cited as justification. Humans can explore more flexibly than robots, make real-time decisions, and conduct complex fieldwork. The argument is that scientific productivity justifies cost and risk. However, robotic missions have demonstrated remarkable capability. Rovers like Curiosity and Perseverance conduct sophisticated analyses and traverse large distances. Sample return missions are planned using robotic systems. The gap between human and robotic capability narrows as robotics, AI, and remote operation improve. The scientific case for human missions is less clear-cut than often presented. Much of the science can be done robotically at lower cost and risk. Human missions add value in certain contexts, but are not strictly necessary for scientific objectives. The true motivation for human missions may be less about science and more about human ambition, national prestige, and the vision of humans as spacefaring. These motivations are valid but distinct from scientific necessity. Conflating them muddles the rationale and makes it difficult to evaluate whether the cost and risk are justified. The environmental impact of launching missions to Mars includes the carbon footprint of rocket launches, the industrial activity required to build spacecraft and equipment, and the consumption of resources. Rockets burn large quantities of fuel, emitting carbon dioxide, water vapor, and other byproducts into the atmosphere. The overall contribution of space launches to global emissions is small compared to aviation or industry, but it is not negligible. As launch rates increase, the impact grows. The irony of damaging Earth's environment in the pursuit of exploring other planets is not lost on critics. Space agencies and companies are developing greener propulsion technologies, such as methane-based fuels that can be produced using renewable energy. But current systems are not environmentally neutral. The ethical question is whether the benefits of space exploration justify the environmental costs. This question is part of a broader debate about resource allocation and priorities in the face of climate change and other terrestrial challenges. The philosophical implications of attempting Mars missions touch on existential themes. Why do humans seek to explore and expand? Is it an innate drive, a biological imperative to spread and survive, or a cultural construct, a narrative we tell ourselves about progress and destiny? The answer shapes how we assess the endeavor. If expansion is imperative, then risk is acceptable as necessary for survival. If it is a construct, then we can choose to prioritize differently. The question of meaning arises. What does it mean to be human in a universe that is vast, indifferent, and mostly uninhabitable? Exploration can be seen as an assertion of meaning, a refusal to accept limits, a declaration that human curiosity and ambition matter even if the cosmos does not care. Alternatively, it can be seen as hubris, an overreach born of arrogance, a failure to accept our place and limitations. These perspectives coexist, and individuals align with different views. The Mars mission becomes a canvas onto which philosophical beliefs are projected. The outcome, success, failure, tragedy, will be interpreted through these lenses, reinforcing existing beliefs rather than resolving the debate. The practicalities of mission planning involve trade-offs at every level. Mass budget is zero-sum. Every kilogram added to one system must be removed from another or compensated by more propellant, which itself has mass. Engineers engage in constant negotiation, prioritizing essentials and cutting desired but non-critical items. The result is a spacecraft and mission plan that meets requirements with minimal margin. This efficiency is necessary to make missions feasible, but leaves little room for the unexpected. When unforeseen needs arise, there is no reserve to draw upon. Creativity and improvisation fill gaps, but not all gaps can be bridged. The mission walks a tightrope, balanced precariously between success and failure. Any push, a failure, an illness, a storm, can tip the balance. The selection of landing sites on Mars prioritizes scientific interest, resource availability, and safety. Sites near the equator have milder temperatures. Sites at higher latitudes have accessible water ice. Sites in low-lying areas have thicker atmosphere, aiding landing but offering less atmospheric pressure reduction. No site is ideal in all respects. Compromises are necessary. The chosen site shapes mission challenges. A polar site provides water but extreme cold. An equatorial site is warmer, but water is deeper or absent. Terrain roughness affects landing risk and mobility. Dust prevalence affects power and equipment longevity. The site is chosen years in advance based on orbital data. Ground truth may differ. Hazards invisible from orbit. Subsurface voids, unstable soil, unexpected rock distributions can emerge after landing. The crew must adapt to the reality they find, which may be more challenging than anticipated. Autonomy versus control is a tension in mission operations. Mission control on Earth has expertise and computing resources, but cannot react quickly due to communication delay. The crew has real-time awareness, but limited expertise, and must manage stress. The balance of decision-making authority must be negotiated. Procedures define who decides what under which circumstances. In practice, ambiguity arises. The crew may disagree with mission control recommendations. Mission control may lack context to understand the situation on the ground. Resolving conflicts takes time and communication bandwidth. In a crisis, there is no time. The crew must act. Afterwards, decisions are reviewed and second-guessed. If the outcome is poor, blame is assigned. The crew is vulnerable to criticism from those who were not present and did not face the pressure. The psychological burden of leadership and decision-making under uncertainty is heavy. Crew commanders carry the weight of responsibility for their team's survival. The potential for guilt, whether decisions were right or wrong, is immense. Simulations and analogs prepare crews for Mars by approximating conditions. Habitat modules in deserts or Arctic regions simulate isolation and confinement. Underwater environments simulate extravehicular operations. Virtual reality replicates Martian landscapes. These analogs have value but are limited. Participants know they can leave. Medical help is available. Supplies can be restocked. The psychological safety net, however thin, is present. True isolation and irreversibility cannot be simulated ethically. The analogs provide training and identify issues, but cannot fully prepare crew for the reality. The gap between simulation and actuality is where surprises occur. The construction of habitats on Mars involves landing prefabricated modules or deploying inflatable structures. Both approaches have challenges. Rigid modules are heavy but robust. Inflatable structures are lighter but more vulnerable to puncture and require reliable deployment mechanisms. Assembly and connection of modules require precise alignment and sealing. Airlocks, utilities, and life support systems must be integrated. Work is performed in suits under Martian gravity, which is easier than microgravity but still cumbersome. Construction errors can compromise pressure integrity. Testing is critical but must be done in place with limited diagnostic tools. Once the crew arrives, the habitat must be functional. There is no time for major repairs or troubleshooting. Pre-deployment missions to test systems before crew arrival are ideal but expensive. The trade-off is between cost and risk. Lower cost means higher risk transferred to the crew. The role of artificial intelligence and automation in Mars missions is increasing. Autonomous systems can monitor equipment, diagnose failures, and execute repairs without human intervention. AI can optimize resource usage, schedule tasks, and provide decision support. These capabilities reduce crew workload and improve reliability. However, AI is not infallible. Software has bugs. Algorithms make errors, especially in unforeseen situations. Over-reliance on automation can lead to complacency and loss of manual skills. When automation fails, humans must take over. But if they have not maintained proficiency, performance suffers. The balance between automation and human control is delicate. Too much automation alienates the crew from systems, reducing situational awareness. Too little places unbearable cognitive load on the crew. Finding the optimal balance is an ongoing challenge in mission design. The cultural and social dynamics within a small, isolated crew are intensely studied. Selection processes screen for psychological stability, teamwork, and stress tolerance. Training emphasizes communication, conflict resolution, and leadership. Despite preparation, interpersonal issues arise. Personalities clash. Cultural differences create misunderstandings. Hierarchies and roles become points of tension. Romantic or sexual relationships may develop, complicating group dynamics. Policies regarding relationships vary, but are difficult to enforce in isolated environments. The crew must function as a cohesive unit. Breakdown of cohesion jeopardizes mission success. Mediation and counseling from Earth are limited by communication delay. The crew must resolve issues internally, relying on maturity and training. The stakes are high. Interpersonal conflict in a survival situation can escalate to violence or sabotage. Selecting the right crew is as critical as designing the right hardware. The question of reproduction in space or on Mars is speculative for early missions, but relevant for long-term settlement. Reduced gravity, radiation, and other factors may affect fertility, pregnancy, and fetal development. Studies on animals in space show developmental abnormalities. Human reproduction on Mars has not been tested and carries unknown risks. Ethical considerations preclude experiments that endanger potential offspring. For early missions, reproduction is not planned and contraception is expected. If a pregnancy occurs accidentally, the medical and ethical challenges are profound. Abortion, childbirth, and neonatal care on Mars are beyond current capabilities. The situation would force decisions with no good options. Long-term settlement requires successful reproduction, but the biological feasibility remains uncertain. Mars may be a place where humans can survive, but not where human populations can sustain themselves across generations. This limitation fundamentally constrains the vision of Mars as a second home for humanity. The use of nuclear power on Mars is likely necessary for reliable, high-output energy. Radioisotope thermoelectric generators convert heat from radioactive decay into electricity and have powered deep space missions for decades. Nuclear fission reactors provide higher power but are more complex and massive. Both options involve regulatory, safety, and public perception challenges. Nuclear systems must be safe during launch, landing, and operation. Accidents can release radiation, contaminating the environment and endangering the crew. Shielding and containment add mass. Public opposition to nuclear technology affects mission approval and funding. Despite challenges, nuclear power is the most viable option for continuous, high-output energy independent of sunlight. Solar panels are vulnerable to dust and seasonal variations in sunlight. Without reliable power, life support fails. The dependence on nuclear systems adds to the list of critical technologies that must not fail. Spare parts and repair materials are selected based on failure predictions, but predictions are imperfect. Some parts fail unexpectedly, others last longer than expected. The inventory of spares is a gamble, carry too few, and critical failures cannot be repaired. Carry too many, and mass is wasted on items never used. 3D printing and additive manufacturing offer the potential to fabricate parts on demand, reducing the need for large inventories. However, printers require feedstock, power, and technical knowledge. Not all materials and part types can be printed. Complex assemblies, electronics, and precision components remain challenging. The capability of in situ manufacturing grows with each mission, but early missions have limited fabrication ability. The crew will face failures they cannot repair and must find workarounds or accept degraded capability. The concept of acceptable degradation acknowledges that not all systems must function perfectly. Some redundancy exists, some systems are less critical, and some functions can be performed manually if automation fails. The crew continuously assesses which systems can be allowed to fail without immediately jeopardizing survival. This triage is a constant background task. Engineers on Earth support the process, running simulations and providing recommendations. The crew's lived experience informs judgments that remote engineers cannot fully appreciate. The tension between engineering analysis and operational reality is managed through communication and trust, but mismatches occur. Mission control may deem a failure acceptable, while the crew feels the impact acutely. Conversely, the crew may dismiss a failure as minor when it has cascading implications not immediately apparent. Effective collaboration requires humility and open communication on both sides. The narratives created around Mars missions serve purposes beyond information. They inspire, educate, recruit, and justify. Space agencies craft narratives emphasizing exploration, courage, and human achievement. These narratives are motivational but can obscure risks and challenges. Critical voices emphasize dangers, costs, and ethical concerns, serving as counterbalance. The public receives conflicting messages and must navigate between optimism and caution. The actual outcome of missions feeds back into narratives, reinforcing or undermining them. A successful mission validates optimistic narratives and silences critics. A failed mission vindicates skeptics and demands accountability. The astronauts are characters in these narratives, often reduced to archetypes. The brave explorer, the tragic hero, the cautionary tale. Their complexity as individuals is lost. The narrative imperative shapes how missions are presented and remembered, influencing future decisions. The end of a Mars mission, whether by successful return or by tragedy, marks a transition. For a successful return, the crew undergoes months of rehabilitation, debriefing, and reintegration. They are celebrated but also scrutinized. Their experiences are analyzed for lessons. They become public figures, ambassadors for space exploration, expected to inspire and advocate. The psychological adjustment from extreme isolation and danger to public life is jarring. Some adapt well. Others struggle with post-traumatic stress, depression, or a sense of disconnection. The remainder of their lives are shaped by the mission, a defining experience that overshadows other accomplishments. For missions that end in tragedy, the processing is different. Grief, investigation, and memorialization dominate. Families and colleagues mourn. Agencies investigate and reform. Memorials are erected. The deceased are honored, their sacrifice remembered. The impact ripples through space programs and public consciousness. Future missions proceed, if at all, with the weight of loss and the pressure to prevent recurrence. The lessons learned are written in the lives of those who did not return. The first humans on Mars will confront the reality that return is not guaranteed. They may hope, they may work toward it, but they cannot escape the knowledge that the odds are against them. This knowledge shapes every moment, every decision, every interaction. It is a heavy burden, a constant shadow. Yet humans are capable of extraordinary resilience and adaptation. They find meaning in hardship, purpose in struggle, connection in shared adversity. The crew will support each other, draw on inner reserves, and persist. They will perform their tasks, conduct experiments, maintain systems, and communicate with Earth. They will live for as long as they can, as fully as circumstances allow. Whether they return or not, their presence on Mars represents a milestone in human history, a step beyond the cradle of Earth into the larger universe. The significance of that step is undeniable. The cost, measured in lives and resources, is substantial. Whether the cost is justified is a question each person answers according to their values. What is certain is that the question will be asked, and the answer will shape humanity's future in space. The first crew's fate, whether triumph or tragedy, will be a turning point, a moment when abstraction became reality, when the dream of Mars met the physics of survival, and when humanity learned once more the price of reaching beyond its grasp.